All right, everyone, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started here again. We're going to talk a little bit about the Reducing Air Pollution Project. But before we do that, I just wanted to go over a little bit of review information with regards to the information in your lesson and how that's going to help you relate to the project. So, obviously, understanding what the objectives of the lesson as they relate to the project are. So, being able to explain the history of air pollution regulations is important. Describing the components of the Clean Air Act of 1990, describe ways to prevent and reduce air pollution, and explain the role of the markets in controlling air pollution are going to be all critical objectives that you understand from the lesson to be able to successfully complete the project. So let's talk a little bit about it, some introductory information. So um, those of you that have taken biology understand that air is essential for living things, okay? And you'd only live for a few minutes without it, okay? And hopefully, as we've gone throughout the year and talked about stewardship throughout our lessons, that you understand that pollution in general, um, there needs to be a concern about it. So, as we sit here and we talk about air pollution specifically, you need to understand the ramifications that pollution in the air can make you sick, it can lead to cancer, and it can aggravate certain respiratory conditions like asthma, um, which is directly effective of your life and your lifestyle. But in addition to that, on a global scale, it harms our wildlife, it pollutes our waters, it destroys crops, it degrades infrastructure like buildings, and in addition, it helps or it contributes to the destruction of our ozone layer and leads to global warming, um, through enhancing the greenhouse effect. So all of these topics that we've been talking about throughout the year, they're all starting to culminate in these projects. So understanding, um, some of the events that led up to this is important. So in the U.S., one of the most effective means for reducing and controlling air pollution at the federal and the national level is through what we call the Clean Air Act. So this is a landmark piece of legislation that talks about guidelines that prevent, that control, that discuss cleanup of air pollution as it relates to the United States. Okay, um, so the key events of the Clean Air Act um, really were set in motion um, back in like 1950 to 1960. Okay, so limits on emissions was part of the Clean Air Act of 63. And then Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. Richard Nixon, our president, created the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, as well as strengthening the Clean Air Act. Okay. The Clean Air Act of 1970 set guidelines um, for specific pollutants in the air, such as ozone and lead and sulfur dioxide and, nitrates, particulates, carbon monoxide. It also allowed you, as a citizen, the right for the first time to take legal action against organizations that violate these restrictions. Um, Even more recently, as early as 1990, the Clean Air Act needed to be strengthened even more. Amendments to this called for the use of low sulfur fuels. It placed a strong emphasis on cost effective ways of reducing air pollution. So when you look a little further at the key elements of it, there were really about 8 tenets to the law. Cleaning up commonly found air pollutants, fines being placed on organizations that exceed safe limits, reducing emissions from motor vehicles, cleaning up air in our national parks, addressing problems that occur when air pollution travels by wind, reducing acid rain, reducing toxic air pollutants, and then protecting the ozone layer were really the key tenets of the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act in 1990. So, important pieces of legislation regardless here. So with that, let's get in and let's talk a little bit about the actual project. Okay, so the project is is essentially a three-part project. Okay, so the first part, let's break it down. Suppose a new coal burning plant in your community is being planned. Under the Clean Air Act, the question is how can the public participate in decisions concerning emission regulations placed on the plant? Okay, and what could you do if the plant is placed in your community and later leads to pollution beyond the laws allowed by the EPA? So what we're looking for this is for you to discuss essentially how the EPA's process for implementing these new regulations on the plant. So talk about the hearings that are involved. Talk about how the Clean Air Act gives you the opportunity to directly get involved. Talk about how all the monitoring is essentially present in there. And then finally, have a discussion about the opportunities to take direct action to get pollution in your community cleaned up. So that's what we would be looking for in part one. Okay. In part two, it asks what are the 6 criteria pollutants monitored under the 1990 Clean Air Act, and what part of the government oversees the monitoring of them in the environment, and what happens if a business emits them above allowable levels. Okay, so again, so the 6 criteria, again, this is information that can be found in your lesson. Talk about those pollutants that we discussed. Okay, the ozone, the lead, the sulfur, the nitrogen, the particulates, and the carbon monoxide, and then talk about how the EPA, for the second part of that, can issue orders requiring violators to comply. So talk about what the EPA does to force those that are above the limits to get within the limits and comply. And then part 3, explain how emissions trading works and identify an advantage and a disadvantage. Okay, so for this, talk about essentially the process of cap and trade. Okay, how credits can be used, and an advantage and a disadvantage of those, and explain how the program must work in order to be successful. Obviously, again, information that you can certainly find in your lesson as you go through it. Okay, so each of these should be about a paragraph. So this should be a good three to 4 paragraphs, or maybe a little bit more. And then support each answer with the information that you found from your lesson. Okay. If you get stuck or something that's not or that you don't feel is easily findable in the lesson, because the lesson does have a lot of material, reach out to me either in the virtual office or through email, and we can get you pointed in the right direction. And we'll be back here next week doing another project as we wrap up, getting closer to the end of the year.